Greetings, theists and non-theists. I am the Atheist Paladin. Okay, so I gotta do this video. I'm seeing lots of videos on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I mean, I've seen videos being put out by Carm. I see it being, debated between Agnostic Man and Aaron K. And I see this sort of debate between Anglican apologists and a case against faith for the general idea: can miracles be proven by the historical method? And my take on this is a little bit different, and that in the sense of while I personally don't think that miracles can be proven by the historical method, I think there is a lot of underlying assumptions that we are not talking about, or that is presented by the Christian case, that are simply not discussed. And I think those issues are important in order to be discussed, because even as we just take this as an event, I believe that there is no census that could ever be brought about that this was an event that it happened in the way that is claimed that it did. And I have lots of reasons to assume so. So when we look at Christian history and Christian writings, the earliest that we get about Jesus is the writings of Paul. The curious thing about the writings of Paul is that he never says anything explicit in such a way that would inherently promote the sort of orthodox idea of Jesus. What is the current orthodox idea of Jesus? And anything beyond that goes out of this would be, of course, heresy. Well, one of them, which is Jesus' virgin birth. Another one is that he is fully man. The other, that he is fully God. And that he is in the sort of Trinity with God. The sort of, not basically the Nicene Creed, right? Where God and Jesus are equal, and Jesus taught and preached for a couple of years, and then he died, resurrected, and resurrected in an actual body. Beyond this, everything else is now considered heresy. The problem with this is that Paul makes very little mention of these facts. He does mention the death and resurrection, but not in such a way it could be very specific. And only once does he actually state that if Christ did not die bodily and come back resurrection, then you are believing in a gospel that is eternally damned. But beyond that, he says nothing much about Christ. If we read the works of Paul, his works are somewhere in 55 AD. Those are his earliest works. And even those, it mentions false apostles, like in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And in Galatians it talks about false teachings and stuff. So, from the very admission of Paul's works, we see already divergent Christianity. And the problem is, using as Paul, at least as far as evidence of a historical Jesus, is very dubious. Let's read 1 Galatians 11 and 12. I certify unto you that the gospel which was preached unto me is not after man. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by revelation of Jesus Christ. So, according to this, he doesn't receive a sort of an apostolic passing of this. He purely got Jesus by revelation. It later goes on to, when he was revealed Christ, it took him 3 years. 3 years for him to see other apostles, namely being Peter and James. So the idea of Paul being a actual reference for an historical Christ is very dubious. So them using him as evidence is very lacking. It's not convincing for me. And so but what we got is some works only in the 2nd century, because after Paul, the Gospels are not written until after 70 AD and into the 2nd century, along with the other letters. So the period between 33 AD and 70 AD of Christianity, very little is known. All we know that there was a Christianity and there was some divergence. And to me, this is a very bad blow to the historical case for Christ. Now, why is that? Well, when we take the view of the orthodoxy, that wasn't the only view. And as far as we know, it wasn't preached very strongly. The orthodox view of God, of Jesus being God and resurrected in fully man form, or fully in bodily form, didn't seem to be preached that much before that. We're not sure of anything else was preached as well. But what we see in the 2nd centuries, we're finally learning that there was a plethora of Christian sects. Take, for example, the Ebionites. They did not believe in the virgin birth of Jesus. But he was fully man, and he was adopted by God. Not that he was God, or part of this Trinity. And the thing is that the Ebionites actually lived in the Jerusalem area. So we have now pretty much a heresy living in the area that can confirm Orthodox Christianity, but they're not. The only other group that lived in Jerusalem were also agnostics, and agnostics are a very broad category because there's several different sects of even Gnostic beliefs. So we already see a differing beliefs about Jesus Christ himself from the earliest point that we can verify and understand Christianity. So not only there were Gnostics, there were also Marcionites, named after their little group leader, or Marcion. He had a completely different radical view, that Jesus Christ was fully God and not man, and that he was not supplemented to the Hebrew God. In fact, the Hebrew God was completely evil in Marcion's eyes, and that Christ preached against that God and for a sort of higher understanding and awareness of God. And he is also very early in Christian history. And as a matter of fact, he was one of the first to actually develop a canon. And mostly those were actually the writings of Paul. The writings of Paul and what was called the Gospel of Paul. And the Gospel of Paul apparently seemed to be a cut-down version of the Gospel of Luke. So it's like Luke minus some parts, basically. And that was his canon. So as we can see, there's already differing views about Christ, and this in the sense of whether he was God or man, and whether his death and resurrection was actually bodily. Because in some Gnostic groups, Christ wasn't here physically; he was something ethereal. And in one where he is tempted to being crucified, he's not really crucified. Somebody else actually takes his place, and he's laughing at the so-called attempt to crucify the Christ. And others where he is crucified, but he receives a spiritually a sort of spirit body. And this is where, of course, when Paul says, let him be terribly condemned against that sort of belief, that Christ is not risen in the flesh. So if we're going to go turn around and say, well, yeah, that was a historical event, whose orthodoxy are we going to believe? Because that's the underlying assumption. We're taking the orthodox story of things and then assuming that particular version of the story is the historical one. And that's absolutely ridiculous. Why should we accept that? Why aren't the other stories more accurate? There are so many differing views of Christianity. Why aren't we going for the Ebionites? Because the Ebionites were the ones that primarily lived in Jerusalem. What we now know as the Orthodoxy, and back then it was Proto-Orthodoxy, lived in Rome. It is now known today as the Catholic Church. But who also lived in Rome was also the Adoptionists, which are very like the Ebionites, but they're pretty much the Gentile version, I guess you can say, and the Valentinians. They also believed. But again, that was another Gnostic group, and so Christ was more divine. So we got a myriad of different Christian beliefs that seem to be located in certain locations, and that there was not one particular story of Christ that seemed to be promoted. But that's not what they would have you believe. That they would have this, that was passed down, that this particular view of Jesus was passed down by the apostles. But we don't have nothing to confirm that, except the church's own records. And the thing is that every sect and denomination pointed to their own apostle and saying, this is where we received this source. The Ebionites, they say they got theirs from Peter and James. Well, today's Catholic Church and Orthodoxy says it comes from Peter. Who are we going to believe? We got two different sects claiming the same apostle, but completely different views of Jesus Christ. So even looking at this as an event, there isn't even an agreement among those who claim to believe that it happened. But they all have different views of how it happened and who the man behind this story was. So if there is no agreement among those things, then why should we give it even any credence? Another thing that I have doubts is that there is a very poor accuracy in the Bible of historical events. What I mean by this is that they give conflicting accounts. All you have to do is look at some of the works of Prophet T.H. or Violently Graceful, and they outline some of these conflicts, even within what is considered Orthodox, the Orthodox canons within the Synoptic Gospels today. That even though that they agree with a lot of the facts, there are still details to which they conflict. Even from the birth of Christ, was it during the reign of Herod or during the reign of Quirinius? That's a gap of 10 years. I'm sorry, it's not reconcilable. It's either or. So there's the first conflict. So we're going to believe Matthew or we're going to believe Luke? Well, what about Jesus' baptism? Again, let's see Violently Graceful video. And what is it? The Gospel of John, it's not mentioned. And yet in Luke, he is baptized, but not, it just mentions that he's baptized, but not by John, because he's already arrested. And yet in Matthew and Mark, he is baptized by John. And even then, there's some divergent parts there. So even among sources that largely agree on stuff, they conflict with one another. And again, you can do this with the examinations of the death and resurrection stories as well. There are details to which they conflict, even though the overarching story seems to agree. Another thing is that it is normally assumed in Christian tradition that Jesus taught for 3 years, approximately 3 to 3.5 years, after the beheading of John. This general belief conflicts with history, because history says that John the Baptist that we do know was beheaded in the final year of Pontius Pilate's reign. And yet Christ was also crucified under Pontius Pilate's reign. So one of those facts is wrong. Either Jesus preached for quite some time before the beheading of John the Baptist, or he wasn't really crucified under Pilate, or that he was, and there's something there that's wrong. So, or that Jesus really had nothing to do with John at all. So as you can see, there's all sorts of conflicting details amongst those who believe and amongst the works and history that we know. So if this is the case, and there are so many details and gaping holes in this, why should I exactly believe this as an historical event? It goes everything against I know about reality, and you guys can't even get the story straight. I would have to assume so many things. I have to assume 99% of the things. Well, they were persecuted, and they could have identified and verified the body in the tomb, and they could have, done all these sorts of things. But in order to accept these things, I'm already accepting church history on their word. These are things that can't be verified by themselves. These are also statements of faith. So to turn around and believe in the resurrection, well, let's just call it what it is. It isn't historical fact. It is absolutely ridiculous and absurd, and let's just call it what it is: faith. In order to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as it always was, is a matter of faith and not historical fact. Thank you.